My doctoral thesis was about environmental politics in Japan. So I studied, I spent about 2.5 years doing field work in Japan in a community in southern Japan with virtually no foreigners around, but my wife and 2 kids, who were 1 and 3 at the time, studying environmental conflict between local villagers who were resisting bringing in a big industrial project that would create a lot of pollution and urban disruption or village disruption along the seacoast. That was, I started that field work in 1979 through 1981, 1978 through 81. I spent about 2.5 years there. So that was already another phase of Japan, even almost before the trade barrier issue, where at that time environmental problems were seen as strictly local things. You know, your local factory is polluting you, and you know who the culprit is, and you can protest about it and try to get them shut down or prevented from coming in the first place, which is what these people were trying to do.
I have to ask you, are they still protesting at the end of the runways at Narita Airport the way it was? And that went on for an awful long time. That was largely symbolic kind of protest.
Yeah. Well, you know, when you go to Narita, they still have barbed wire everywhere to prevent radical students and disgruntled farmers from staging protests. And there may still be, I think the last holdout farmers have decided to sell their land, though, and I think it's pretty much over now. But at the time I was doing my research, that was a big example of movement protest and power in Japan to hold up a national project like that for 20 years or more. You know, yeah, they were very determined in at least building an extra runway there. So a lot of people think of East Asia as more or less absent of social movements, but it's a seething hotbed at times. And my original question was, how do social movements operate in a non-Western society, particularly in Japan? And I had a long background in Japanese studies before I did that, so I knew the language and cultural background. And what are the constraints faced by a social movement in facing a relatively centralized state? And what are the relationships of influence and power? And in doing that, I noticed what one could call networks of influence and power pervading the society. So if you can imagine a molecular model, in a way, of networks, of relationships among actors, with the actors being organizations like social movements or government agencies or businesses, and them asserting influence, trying to assert influence over each other. This is the kind of model that came to my mind as I was writing my thesis and later published a book on this topic. And that kind of model has continued to be a research paradigm for me. And actually, as I came out of the anthropological fieldwork phase, I began to realize that other people were approaching this kind of modeling of social interaction from a highly quantitative approach known as network studies, and in particular policy network studies, which actually literally set out to measure the relations of influence among organizations in a quantitative, analytical, calculable format, using the new tools of network analysis. And so my current research project is using that methodology and applying it to a study of why nations are responding differently to the global climate change crisis. And the current project involves so I've expanded far beyond my initial focus on one country to look at the broad international scope and use the methodology, the quantitative methodology, to study the formations of influence in different societies that affect how they respond to this common threat of global climate change. You know, from a strictly sort of social scientific viewpoint, it's a very interesting experimental design because you have 15, 20 different countries that are major contributors to global climate change, all with very different backgrounds in many ways and conditions in many ways. But they're all in the same pot together. You know, they're all being slowly boiled by this rising temperature of global climate change. And like the old metaphor goes about the frog, you know, they say that, you've probably all heard that, but if you throw a frog into a pot of boiling water, it'll jump right out. But if you throw it into cold water and slowly raise the temperature, you know, it'll just sit there until it's boiled to death. And so we don't know at what point these 20 or 30 frogs will decide to jump out of the pot. And it's even more difficult because they're all dependent on each other. I mean, if some of them jump and others don't, they're still going to get, even the ones who jump are still going to get boiled. So it's a difficult problem. So this project sets out to try to explain variation in national responses to climate change, both as individual units and how they react collectively to each other and with each other under global agreements, and why we haven't made much progress thus far in responding to climate change. So I think that the main point of the talk would be to introduce and develop hypotheses about the causes of national variation in response to climate change, and to test them in the international research project, which we know is COMPON. COMPON means Comparing Climate Change Policy Networks, and it's, I chose that acronym because it's, in Japanese it means basis. So with my early Japanese roots, research roots, I continued that thinking that way. So the background is, and I won't go through any of these details because everyone here is totally familiar with all these things, I'm sure, but the fact of global climate change, the human causes of global climate change, the consequences of global climate change, both in trends and singularities, that there are obvious trend consequences. The more we raise the planetary temperature, the more intense will various effects become, such as intensity of hurricanes and sea level rises and droughts and other very predictable effects. But at the same time, we have the danger of singularities, which are relatively unpredictable, but we know they're possible, such as the total melting of the Greenland ice cap and the Arctic ice, which will be a kind of irreversible effect, for at least for millennia, that will raise the sea levels maybe 6 or more meters. And the melting of the permafrost in the polar areas, which will release massive amounts of methane into the atmosphere, which is also a potent greenhouse gas. Those are known as singularities that are not easily reversible. Effectively not reversible trends, sudden changes, and also the Atlantic Ocean current. It's the Gulf Stream that comes up around, and those go down by Europe and keeps Europe warm. That could fail because of the melting of the Greenland ice cap, which makes the saltwater less salty. And that would ironically plunge Europe into a kind of global, local cooling effect. So there's these singularities that are even more dangerous in some ways. So the responses to global climate change are basically two: mitigation or adaptation, as you know. And adaptation is if the sea is rising, we build dikes. And mitigation is if the sea is rising, we find out why and try to remove that cause so the sea doesn't rise, basically. So mitigation in this sense means the reduction of global greenhouse gas atmospheric levels that are the root cause of global warming. And so the international negotiations on this have proceeded since the early 1990s, with the founding document being the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And their pledge was that we should achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at low enough level to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So almost every nation signed on to that, including the US. And it's a good moral pledge to take, but it has no teeth in it. It doesn't force anybody to do anything at that point. And so, what are dangerous anthropogenic interference? Well, at what point does climate change become dangerous? And as you can see, that's a field open for endless controversy, as it already has been subject to. You know, is Katrina the result of climate change or not? You know, if it is, well, it's obviously already dangerous. Is the submersion of a few Pacific island nations great danger or not? Or can they just move and it's really not that big a deal? And so forth and so on. So I'm sure you've seen this and I won't go through it all, but depending on how much the global atmosphere warms, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, since pre-industrial times we've warmed already through our emissions almost 1 degree. And most climate change scientists have decided that warming of 2 degrees, if we can keep it below 2 degrees, it's not dangerous. There'll be some effects here, but if we go beyond 2 degrees, then it gets increasingly dangerous. So recently the thought has been, well, what can we do to keep global climate change from below 2 degrees centigrade? And I won't go into all the dangers here because that's a lecture in itself, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that. This is from the Stern report, The Economics of Climate Change. So, even to achieve the 2 degree centigrade increase limit, we have to have the global 50-50, which means that we have to reduce our annual global emissions of greenhouse gases from, well, people variously say 1990 or 2000, at any rate, either one, by 50% globally. So what we're doing right now, we have to have it in order to avoid dangerous interference in the climate system. But that's global. But since developing countries cannot be expected to do that, like China cannot be expected to do that by 2050, the advanced countries who've had the pleasure of polluting the atmosphere or the pleasure of the benefits of massive burning of fossil fuels for the last 150 years have to do much more than that. So 80%, 85%, 90%. So you think of the task before us in the industrialized countries like the United States is a vast task. As you can see, the dangerous interference will then, the vast task is one of an attempt to move the gradual emissions of greenhouse gases, which will cause temperature change, from what's called a business as usual scenario. If we do nothing and keep building power plants that are fired by coal and drive our SUVs and so forth, this will be the business as usual. And of course, China and India are coming online, and China is now the largest global contributor of greenhouse gases. So this will be our. So we'll by 2100 we'll get up to 4 degrees, and then as singularities occur, it could go much higher than that. But if we are successful in reducing our climate change gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, it's possible then to level it off at around a 2 degree scenario. So to do that, then we have to bring down the total emissions, global emissions of greenhouse gases like this. But some countries will have to be allowed to do more emissions, but other countries like the U.S., like this, will have to go way down. If you have any questions or comments along the way, please just feel free to jump right in. And this is all just background. So we know that energy emissions are mostly from power, industry, transport, buildings, and then agriculture, non-energy emissions from waste, land use like cutting down forests, and types of tillage in agriculture depends on affect how much methane is put out by agriculture. So there are many sources that we can get at, and as a result, there are many different types of policies that need to be considered for creating this transition to a low or carbon neutral type of social system, economy and public consumption and so forth. And people have proposed different solutions. The most popular one is by two Princeton economists, Pakala and Sokolow, who have this concept of wedges. And they say that we can put these different wedges in, start slow, and each wedge will account for 1 gigaton of greenhouse gases per year by the time of 2055. And if we put in 7 of these, we'll be able to get a flat path. And if we put in more, then we'll be able to start decreasing it. And just in terms of, again, background stuff, but just to give an idea of the different types of policy options that are available, in their mind they give all this range of, these are all possible wedges. And each of these wedges, it's important to note, like methane management, reducing methane coming from hog feedlots and waste ponds and agricultural methods. This is not managing it, I mean, from the permafrost, that's a singularity. Or from forest and soil, reducing rainforest deforestation, decarbonized fuels, carbon capture and storage, energy efficiency, better refrigerators and cars that don't use so much fuel, and many things like that. And then fuel displacement by low carbon electricity, like windmills and geothermal and water, hydro and solar and such. And so up to now, those methods have been left up to the different countries, and the only binding agreement we've had globally has been the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, which is based on the UNFCCC, and it was ratified in 2005, and that's the only globally binding commitment we've managed to achieve concerning reduction of greenhouse gases. And that was only, as you recall, ratified because 55 countries around the world, who together constituted 55% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions at that time, agreed to be bound by its rules. And the US, most notably, and Australia too at the time, rejected it. And Australia finally accepted it, but the US is still has been rejected it. But nonetheless, they were able to cobble together enough countries, excluding the developing countries, purposely. And so the basic deal was that each country should reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by about an average of 6% from 1990 levels. And they should do so by the so-called commitment period, which was only starting 3 years after this ratification. The commitment period being 2008 to 2012, which we're right in the middle of now. So, and now we're building a post-Kyoto regime that is supposed to encompass all countries in the world to achieve this global vision of greenhouse gas reductions. And that's going to be decided in Copenhagen in 2009. But the net result of this so far has been very little. And the world has largely continued on the business as usual track. And countries have not been very successful overall in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions due to lots of resistance. These wedges create lots of resistance, just like when you split wood. I don't know if you've ever split wood, but you take a piece of wood and you hit it with your axe, make a crack, and then you put a wedge in. It's shaped like that, and you put it in, and then you take a sledgehammer and you pound down the wedge until you can finally crack the wood in two, and there's a lot of resistance there. And in the same way, putting wedges into society to reduce greenhouse gas emissions produces a lot of resistance too. For instance, just in methane management, it means reducing, for instance, the volume of cow and pig flatulence and emissions, particularly from manure ponds. The easiest way is to stop eating meat, but how can you convince the public to stop eating meat? The trend is the reverse. Or energy efficiency, using public transport instead of personal vehicles, but try convincing Exxon and GM and other groups that are for that. So there's a lot of social resistance to any of these transformations, and so that's why we need to study the processes where there is some success evident, even though we're still on largely the business as usual track, for hope that there can be hints and ideas there on how we can forge a better future. So even among the
Can
green...
you
the
take
si-
a question or comments or the...
Sure, anytime, yeah.
Going back to your previous slide, it struck me that you took sort of extreme solutions rather than easy solutions. And what I know about agriculture, for example, is there are a variety of ways, short of not eating meat, to reduce methane emissions.
Yeah.
How you compound the feed, shift between beef, pork, poultry, fish.
Right.
And some of those things are going to get.
Yeah.
And you're seeing global shifts in that. So
Yeah, that is an extreme position, you're right.
Yeah.
There's what they call the low-hanging fruit, which, you know, if people would make their better practices, we could reduce certain amounts of
Now,
greenhouse
the
gas.
advantage of low-hanging fruit, though, is that it can be incremental. You know, each gain, particularly in conservation, builds on itself over time.
Mhm.
So while it may look low-hanging, it's also very productive.
Right. Well, yeah, how much we can gain from the low-hanging fruit is a big source of debate, and whether it can be sufficient or not, you know, to reach these radical goals of greenhouse gas reduction is a big question. But certainly, I don't mean to only pose the radical and unattainable alternative, but there are lots of small steps we are taking and do need to take. I totally agree. Yeah. But overall, so far, then we can see that among countries, some of these are signatories, most of them except the United States, and some are not. But to the Kyoto Protocol, you can see that a few countries have attained some significant reductions. Germany, in part because it includes the depressed East Germany, as a means of by policy decisions, whereas others have not. Even though many of these have agreed to targets, they're just not on track to achieve them, like New Zealand or Canada, who agreed to much lower levels than it's showing.
Where's Russia?
Well, Russia's not part of that. Oh, yeah, they are part of that, you're right. But I don't have them here. But they're, you know, the Russian case is different, as well as the Eastern European cases, because of, they're called transition countries, and they're actually allowed to raise their greenhouse gas levels because of their originally depressed economies at the time of ratification. So, in beginning then to develop hypotheses about these differences that we can test with our research project, we find that you know, some nations are more compliant or more successful than others. And then in this COMPON research project, we're attempting to establish hypotheses about these differences and begin to investigate them through this empirical network analysis.
Jeff?
Yeah.
Just curious, as you're an expert in policy network analysis, and therefore you have this framework, and it looks like intuitively a great context for it.
Yeah.
I'm curious about what you know about any previous research that's addressed this issue of variation in national response to climate change that would use alternatives, so that you could give us a sense of where you see maybe the shortcomings of alternative frameworks as a way to evaluate also the relative strengths or shortcomings of a policy network approach like yours.
Right, right. Well, that gets into a lot of in-depth, you know, theoretical and methodological questions, but we have tried to review extant work about, not only about response to climate change, but also about, more widely, about response to environmental degradation and response to international environmental agreements. And I do review some of that here as we go along.
Okay.
As far as the strengths of the method goes, you know, and it's a big question in comparative politics and in historical and comparative sociology or political sociology. You know, how you can best compare, do comparative research. And up to now with our tools before policy network research, we've mostly been limited to either individual level surveys, that look at political culture and things like that, or institutional studies that examine in depth certain policy-making moments and try to argue for the effect of certain types of factors. And that oftentimes depends upon your theoretical perspective. Like if you're really into institutions, particularly say formal institutions, you can argue for their effect. Other people have advanced ideas from social movements or a host of theoretical hypotheses. But the advantage of, so there's a kind of abstract or rather theory-based effort with kind of case study background or evidence on the one hand, or a more empirical one based upon individual level surveys. Those are the two dominant methods, I would say. And they only give a certain degree of understanding of how there's a big gap there between the evidence and understanding how different political and social systems operate, actually, to make decisions. So on the methodological front, I feel that the policy network approach, properly specified and advanced beyond its present stage, which I'm trying to work on, gives us a way of looking into the systems in operation that create the sort of meso-level systems that create the macro-level phenomenon of decisions. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you.
that's where I'm coming from. After decades of work on this, on the methodological issues as well as the substantive issues, that's my approach, at least. And so, what are the social conditions that cause social learning, so that they give urgent priority to predicted climate change risks and make effective greenhouse gas reductions? It's a key question here. And the notion of social learning comes from the Social Learning Project, which was led by William Clark at the Kennedy School, and is one of those precursor research projects based upon more case study and information that led to certain conclusions about what causes nations to react more or less compliance to international environmental treaties, not just climate change. So basically the biggest problem is what we call the problem of collective action, that we need to cooperate to solve these problems, but yet we're impelled to follow our individual short-range self-interest, both on individual and national levels and concerning global treaties. Thinking about this problem, there are two general theory positions, at least in environmental sociology, that say, one that says social learning can take place and societies can change, and the other says that there's not a possibility of cooperative social learning, really, because the interest groups are just too divided on these issues. The Exxons and the General Motors who are invested in the present situation just basically refuse to change, and it can only occur through a powerful advocacy coalition that creates political conflict and eventually overcomes that resistance. There can't be a more harmonious stakeholder learning process. And
That sounds more like a spectrum, really, than two alternative. Because clearly there are going to be people who are going to resist. There's not going to be a sort of kumbaya moment.
yeah, yeah,
Isn't that right? I mean,
exactly, yeah.
So these people go at each other, and on this issue today, I mean,
Yeah, well, this is one of the problems with kind of reductionist theory. If you become a disciple or apostle of a certain theoretical school, then you see everything in that lens and the dangers of abstraction.
Sorry.
But they're useful for thinking about the issues. But we're trying to bring it down to a more empirical level. So we have the knowledge, dominant scientific consensus, but it hasn't produced much action so far. So why is there this gap between knowledge and action? So in some of the research we've been doing, and I've been doing in particular, is the PI of the project, interviewing in Europe and in Japan, and review of extant literature. One of the interesting hypotheses is that by Martin Jenneker, who's he's a German political scientist, and his basic idea is that corporatism is the answer. Corporatism as the maximum stakeholder participation system from different interest groups. And he's a German, and he draws on the German example, and he says it's the German corporatist system of decision-making, which allows for a lot of stakeholder participation and get-together and kumbaya moments and so forth, that has created enough mutual understanding of the problems and the dangers to allow Germany to make quite a bit of advance in terms of conscious policy. And some of these outcomes are the feed-in tariff system, high levels of use of wind power, and so forth. And also the Swedish case, which is also corporatistic. But contrary to that hypothesis, if you compare, I mean, that hypothesis makes sense if you compare Germany and Sweden to the US, but once you compare Germany to Austria or Germany to Japan, both of which have variants of corporatist systems, then it's obvious that corporatism by itself doesn't hold water. Because Austria and Japan are both quite laggards in meeting their Kyoto.
Perhaps you should say just a word, if you don't mind, about what corporatism is for people who haven't studied political science.
Oh, okay. Well, corporatism is a system of interest group mediation by peak association. So and it's typically, up to now, it's only been used to represent labor versus business groups. And so you have the whole range of unions, and they're organized under the representative power of their peak labor association. It's like as if the AFL-CIO in the United States had much greater representative power for all unions than it does. And on the same side, business is organized in a similar structure, and like the equivalent of the National Association of Manufacturers would have much more binding negotiatory power to set national labor standards, such as minimum wage and compensation and a host of other policies related to business and economic conditions. And so he was translating that, saying that this is also working in Germany for the ecological case. But when I interviewed in Austria, Austria is supposed to be the strongest corporatist system. And there's a difference in the way these work, in that you have state corporatism and social corporatism. State corporatism is where the interest groups are working under the guidance of state bureaucracies. And of course, the most notorious example of that is fascism, where they become just the puppets of state bureaucracies. But a softer example is, say, in the Japanese case, where the state strongly mediates and advises and enters its policy preferences into the negotiation. But in Austria, the state is completely out of it, and in Austria and Germany too, the peak associations have much more autonomous power to decide their policies that really become national policy, as opposed to our U.S. case where we have elections and then politicians talk about what should be some aspects of policy like minimum wage, and other aspects of policy like wage levels are left entirely up to market bargaining, although of course policies can affect that, but they're not regulatorily determined by these central organizations. So this is where we're talking about institutional differences in societies that could really create differences in how they're responding to crises like climate change.
And are you going to try to unravel the Germany-Austria case as you go on?
Well, I don't have time to do all that, but right now, but just as an example of how we're developing hypotheses about these issues, drawing both upon extant theory and, of course, Jennecke in his work did a lot of empirical work before coming up with those theories, but then our own inquiries in different national cases. And my own, for instance, my own inquiry in Austria showed that the peak associations for both labor and business were quite happy with the way they had the system sewed up for themselves, and they didn't like these interlopers coming in, these environmentalists, and they didn't even let them into the corporatist negotiation. So they were pretty much outside. So it shows that, boy, pure corporatist systems can be very exclusionary. Which led me to think that the German and Swedish case have another element which Austria doesn't have, which is the presence of the Greens or the long dominance of a social democratic party. And that social democratic dominance in the German case, plus the Greens, has led, in my understanding, to a kind of taming or domestication of the power of business. To make, in the United States, we've let business become completely deregulated and follow their own lead with the result of what we see before us. But for a long time, in Germany, Sweden, rule of social democratic parties since the end of World War II, largely, with more alternation in Germany than in Sweden, has led to a situation where business has become used to serving social goals and public goods purposes in a conscious way, accepting government restraint and guidance much more consciously. So, for instance, in Sweden, when Bert Bolin, who was the founder of the IPCC, started the mini version of the IPCC in Sweden in 1990, and implemented it in Sweden, and began to suggest ways that businesses could, conserve on energy and many other greenhouse gas related activities. Reportedly there, according to Sweden, my interviews in Sweden, that business was jumped right on the bandwagon and was very happy to cooperate.
So is social democratic dominance necessary and sufficient, or does it have to be an independent green party, or just a powerful environmental movement, or what? How does it all play out? You've got a social democratic government in the saddle for an extended period of time. All of the environmental issues would just automatically get absorbed and transmitted into ameliorative policy.
Well, no, and that's why this kind of political institutional explanation is insufficient. And why we have to go further and look at other hypotheses about causes in national variation as well. And of course, we're confining ourselves here to social and political and cultural variables, not talking about so much about geophysical situations like vulnerability to climate change, immediate effects like in Bangladesh or something like that. But here, just in these kind of variables.
And among really high-income countries, you've got a pretty small n, too.
Yeah,
so
prosperity also is a big deal. Right. So that we're unpacking the limits to this kind of theorizing, too, that we have to expand beyond in order to test the full range of, and understand the full range of reactions we're seeing among the about 20 countries now that are incorporated in parts of this COMPON research project. In the Swedish case, you had also, and in the German case, you had popular movements, highly activated about environmental issues, that fed into the political parties and were accepted as part of the social democratic dominance in Sweden. But in Germany, social democracy is based upon a kind of leftist understanding, and in Europe, highly influenced by Marxism, which is the idea that human beings can conquer nature through industrial productivity and transform society that way. And so this idea of environmental limits was originally anathema to social democratic parties in Europe too. So that's why there was a big struggle between the Social Democrats and the Greens in Germany, but now they've reached a more, somewhat of a rapprochement. But that's why the Green philosophy and the founders of the Green Party in Germany said we're neither left nor right, but in front. You know, because they had a different vision of how society had to operate in order to survive in a world of ecological limits. It was not part of the founding philosophy of either the left-wing parties coming from a kind of Marxist socialist background or the right-wing parties that worship the freedom of the market. So there are these other conditions like activation of interest and concern that are very important, and the receptivity of the culture to science and the kind of rationalized view that science could be a guide to where our society should go in the future. You know, that's a kind of very abstract idea that most cultures are not quite ready to accept. And so, first of all, we have to understand, well, why do societies accept science as a guiding principle? And so if we look more basically at these issues, we can see that, well, there's a stakeholder participation effect and there's an advocacy coalition effect. There's two different ways of looking at why societies might accept science, aside from the science culture content itself, which is an independent variable. But one of our hypotheses is that other things being equal, which of course they really aren't, but if we had an infinite number of cases, other things being equal, that if the stakeholders on the issue of climate change, unions, environmental groups, businesses, householders, etc., could form an organization, could get together and talk about the issue, that there'd be a common logic of survival which would lead them to begin to accept the dominant scientific information instead of rejecting it or denying it. And that would spread acceptance of the situation through the society and build social support, which would lead to eventually to more effective responses. That's one way. But if that doesn't work, on the other hand, it might have to start from a coalition like NGOs and movements and certain sectors of the populace that really valued that, and they would have to fight against more recalcitrant sectors of the society like business and labor in order to make this view dominant enough that a society can take real response. So I know I'm running through this very quickly, and it's a lot of stuff here, but just to try to give you some idea of the way our hypotheses about this have evolved. And this advocacy coalition perspective is the result of the social learning group that I mentioned. So we're trying to pick up on some of these results and refine them further and test them in our project by tracing the networks of science information flow and acceptance and use in different societies, and coming from the IPCC. And this is just one example of a project we did in Japan 10 years ago. And this is a horrible, meatballs and spaghetti thing where we measured about 120 different organizations and the networks of information exchange between them concerning global environmental issues. This wasn't just climate change, but climate change was a big deal, part of it in Japan. And this is empirical analysis using network analysis where you can see that the society is differentiated into different sectors, with these being the environmental groups and these being the business groups and the government organizations in between. And here's the IPCC on the outside sending networks of information flow into the society. But so if we isolate that, we can see that the IPCC sends directly to certain organizations in the society, and that those organizations, when they're asked to judge which organizations are influential in global environmental policymaking within the country of Japan, an amazing number of respondents, organizational respondents, that is, we're talking about organizational networks here, checked off the IPCC, and that's why it's so big. Just as big as the core economic and environmental agencies in the country. So this is an example of how, this is just a graphic display where we can do this mathematically and various statistical procedures and network analysis procedures to understand the degree of flow of information in different societies coming from the IPCC and how it's being used and understood in the given society. So that's
I know you've got a lot to get through, and I don't want to stop you, but I suspect others might have the question too. What exactly is being measured? That is, what is the nature of the questionnaire? What are you asking these people? How much do you get? How much do you believe it? How much do you act on it?
Well, basically, yes, but in a variety of different networks and political behaviors. But to get this information, we asked 120 organizations within Japan to look at a list of the same 120 organizations, plus 30 international organizations. And check off, we selected the political officer of the given organization who was most knowledgeable about that organization's political activities in Japan. We tried to get that kind of person and asked that person to check off all the organizations from which they received information about climate change that they considered to be very important. And with that information, basically, we're able to create an input-output matrix of receivers and senders of information and look at, although we didn't question directly to the internationals, so they're a separate category, but we can look at relative centrality and flow of information among the organizations within the country. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, and there are ways of cross-checking this too with, double questions like who sent and who received, and so forth. A lot of further details. But this is just a little methodological aside. So in the COMPON project, we have 18 or so national cases where we have actual teams that have been created in each country, consisting of one or more lead scholars plus graduate students or other scholars, and they have already or have applied for funding to carry out our survey in each country of inter-organizational relationships, of network flow, of influence, of participation in policy-making decisions concerning climate change. So we can begin to look at the effect of stakeholder participation and test it, and look at the effect of advocacy coalitions and test them and see how they're affecting the response of nations. So we have teams in Japan, China, Taiwan, Korea, New Zealand, Thailand, Canada, US, Brazil, Sweden, Germany, Austria, UK, Norway, Netherlands, Greece, Russia, India, and also the international arena. So our NSF grant has funded the teams in the less prosperous countries, especially, in China, plus the US, Russia and India, and the international case. And other countries have found their own funding now. Korea's received funding from their government, Taiwan's applying. Japan has already, our cases in Japan have been supported by another foundation. A graduate student has done the New Zealand case. Thailand is kind of dormant right now. The Canadians applied for a grant and failed, and they're going to try again. The U.S. is NSF. Brazil has received funding from the U.S. NSF because of the researchers originally Danish, but studied at an American university. I don't know how it worked out. The Swedes have received funding from the Swedish government. Germans are applying. Austrians are applying. UK are applying. Norway's applied once. And Netherlands so far are not able to get it. But different states in Greece working on it. Different states, but we'll be able to get enough cases. And we're set up a global monitoring system eventually where we hope to repeat the survey over time and create something like the Global Meteorological Survey where we can look at, have a constant inflow of information about the policies that governments are using and why they're doing that and how they're responding as the pot boils more and more. So I can't go into any more of this here, but I've already talked too long, but that's a quick overview of some of the hypotheses. And a lot of these hypotheses then we're specifying in network terms more specifically, but the general way of thinking about some of the social variables that are affecting national responses and how to test them, yeah.
Hey Jeff, I'd be curious if you could tell us, without going back to that patently unreadable graph, the web there, about what you think are some non-intuitive, surprising findings. So for instance, as you talked about, helpfully, gave us a sense of how in Japan, various respondents talked about the relative importance of information from certain institutions. The IPCs, the bigger the space, looks like they're more important, so the IPCC is pretty important there. Look like a lot of government agencies were important there. And that's, to me, intuitive. Tell us about some non-intuitive findings, where maybe in China or something that people, for instance, might key off of the information given by a company or from employee groups, or I'd just be curious, what were some of the non-intuitive findings?
Oh, well, to me, the fact that 10 years ago, actors throughout Japan would give such a sense of importance and credibility to the IPCC was, at that time, to me, was pretty non-intuitive, you know. And I think that's an important variable that we have to look at cross-nationally.
You mean because they were non-Japanese, or what? Or
Just that a sovereign nation would allow a sense of such importance to be given to an international agency, you know, and it's so different from what would happen in the U.S.
But I just want to follow up on that. These weren't official response. I mean, these were all a lot of different groups, right? I mean, this wasn't the nation as a collectivity taking it seriously. Or maybe there were official agencies there, but these were independent groups taking it seriously.
Well, society as a whole, yeah, giving that, but overall, that kind of credence to the IPCC, I think, is pretty rare. At least compared to the United States.
You mean, yeah.
It's much stronger.
So,
And that shows why Japan has been sometimes a leader in global climate change negotiations.
So I got this, I'm reviewing this paper, I gotta throw this at you and you tell me why there's nothing to worry about in your study with it. I'm reviewing a paper right now for a journal in the international business that takes issue with all sorts of survey-based data that's coming out of the World Bank on corruption. And the way they, I think, rather persuasively make the point is that surveys that involve talking to particularly domestic government agencies, domestic businesses, domestic individuals, tend to understate corruption in their own environment with a direct relationship to the level of political rights and civil liberties that they have. So the idea is that in more repressive regimes, they say, oh, you know, things are great. Like in Eritrea, people say we got the same corruption levels in Germany, right? So probably not the case. So the story is, you got to correct for this, or you got to weigh this thing down. So what it makes me think about in this context is that individuals I'm going to make a proposition, and you tell me why. It's just the data tells you just the opposite. In China, they put much more weight on information they get from government agencies. When they tell you about where do you get information, they say, oh, we get it from government, it's so important, it's so great, right? It's so helpful. And that would be consistent with this paper that says, absolutely they do, because if they don't say that, right, they're going to get the thumb down on it. Okay, so now tell me why that's absolutely not the case in your data and I have nothing to worry about.
Oh, well, no, it is a problem. But the response depends on the kind of question you're asking. Like if you go into a government agency and says, well, and ask them, well, please tell me how much corruption you engaged in today. You know.
Yeah, they don't quite do that. But here I was thinking, you say, what kind of information is important for you for figuring out how to respond to climate change? Guessing it. And then I would guess in certain kinds of regimes, again, ones that are more repressive, that there would be more of an inclination by especially domestic respondents to say, boy, I look, there's important information coming from government agencies, from public agencies, as opposed to, say, places where people might say that's all bunk. They give us I need to go to that international group, or I need to go to Greenpeace, or I need to go to some other
Yeah, well, then that is the case for a lot of issues in China. Well, this is a problem we thought about for a long time, and so far I should mention that in between my field work, I engaged in a project here with a master of quantitative network analysis, David Noak, who's in our department, and we did a project on comparing labor policy that I was talking about in Japan, the U.S., and Germany, including a German social scientist. And those are all three pluralistic democracies where each researcher had pretty good access, and they weren't, but we didn't ask, well, what kinds of transfers are you interested in between organizations that could influence organizational decisions? And in those countries we asked, well, what other organizations not only give you information, but political support, or with whom you have ongoing sense of reciprocity, of long-term mutual aid, and those kinds of things. We didn't ask them, where do you get bribes from, or something like that, because you just can't, you have to know what the limits are and try to go around them and ask questions that could still be revealing, but not put the respondents in jeopardy in some way, or be obviously non-productive. And that's, so you limit it in the kind of information you can get, but I think still you can get enough information to provide, interesting commentary on some of these hypotheses. And the researchers will use other sources of information too. I mean, documentary and also interviews, that will be guaranteed anonymity, but will be coded for information. So use a more comprehensive, broad-scale approach to information gathering too. Try to maximize what we can do. And the problem of global climate change is such a global one that everybody's concerned about it, and the levels of information and belief are something that aren't personally incriminating, and the sources of information are not necessarily personally incriminating. So I think we can get interesting, if not perfect, information. I hope. Otherwise, I'm wasting my time for the last 3 and future 10 years.
I'm sure that's not true. But one thing that you might say something about is the way these relate. For example, I can imagine one concrete research question. What determines international variation in a sense of urgency across the population, a certain level of urgency across the population? That seems to me to be a different question from how easily that urgency is, how effectively that urgency might be mobilized into political action and policy initiative, right?
But there is a relationship.
Well, I'm sure there is,
Yeah.
and I take it that's what you're working on, and I take it that somehow these networks help you are somehow related to corporatism or the difference in infrastructure across the states in some way that you haven't talked about. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, well, we were looking at the meso level here. So if the micro level is individuals and their attitudes and beliefs, the meso level is interorganizational networks, and the macro level is the state or large-scale institutions like the market and ultimate decisions. We're trying to gather information on all those levels from a slice through the middle there. And so a lot of the public opinion in pluralistic societies is represented by NGOs and movements, but of course in China and even in Russia today, those are extremely weak and constrained. So those kinds of sources of information will necessarily be weaker. And of course, the effect of public opinion is much weaker as well on the state, because it's just not recognized very strongly. So that's a very thorny problem to deal with. And we're not doing the public opinion survey level, so we'll have to use secondary data to get at those kinds of public opinion issues. Does that respond to what you're saying?
Yes, I guess I'm trying to, economists always think at the micro level and try to, think of the individual as the unit and then building up, and that's why sociology and economics are quite different.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm trying to think of how these meso-level institutions are both affected by and affect, though, individuals' awareness and determination to act, or to have the state act on their behalf. And that was the spirit of the question. Because it seems to me that the way how effectively these organizations credibly portray the problem to individuals could have a lot of impact on, how much public opinion really supports things. Because public opinion isn't, if it's widespread then it isn't seen so much as a kind of interest group out there, but it's something that people have as a common interest. And that seems to be growing here. But how would you characterize it in the United States today?
Well, one methodological difference is that one sort of axiom or assumption is that the meso level of political organization has its own autonomous and important effects upon policy outcomes. And so interorganizational relationships representing different diffuse interests are where they sort of crystallize those interests and represent them to each other are extremely important in the actual formation of not only government policy, but say corporate reactions and as you say, also in the formation of effective public opinion. So that's one point. It's a general thesis about this policy network approach that we're using. And then as far as the U.S. case goes, here we have, I think we can see similar effects. I mean, for instance, in Obama and his circle of policy advisors and support groups, including environmental think tanks and sort of modernized, ecologically more sensitive, aware labor and such give a higher priority to global warming than the public does. The public, global warming is about 15 on their list of concerns, and so it's not a top priority, but Obama has mentioned it as a very important priority for the government. So I think the answer can be found in those levels of organizational support and intellectual currents among organizations that are creating different policy priorities than the public is at large holds right now for the U.S.
I don't want to dominate these questions.
I'm trying to understand, basically, oversimplifying, I'm sure, but your work is trying to explain what is decided by how it's decided. And a source of skepticism I have is how do you take account of the who pays, who benefits? Example, Japan is 120 million people going to 90 million people, 90 million 60-year-olds. The United States is 300 million going to 400 million 30-year-olds. Very different circumstances, even if they had the same process for making decisions, they would come to different conclusions about what to do. So how does that factor in?
Well, first of all, Japan and the U.S. in that comparison, you could say have similar processes on the level of formal institutions, but at the level of real influence relationships among groups, they're actually extremely different. The way the real flow of power operates, and secondly, the demographic situation, as well as other problems in the two countries, such as the relative availability of energy resources, for instance, really figure into the ideologies and preferences of the dominant interest groups and other types of organizations in society. And so when we interview in our survey and also in our interviews, we ask a lot about organizational preferences and stances on different issue priorities for their countries, and particularly around climate change and energy supply, but somewhat to do with related other issues too. And so I think that those kinds of questions that like demographic questions like you raised can seep into and affect how a nation thinks about climate change. Like, you know, in the US, an appropriate response by Obama is to utilize that young workforce and provide billions of dollars for retrofitting insulation in homes and, you know, employ all the unemployed people. So, you know, maybe after his bailout plan here, the stimulus plan proceeds in a couple of months, you'll find your unemployed stockbroker, you know, knocking at your door and offering to put in free insulation. Or at least probably other types of manual workers will, in fact, be doing that sort of thing. But in Japan, you know, you're not going to find a lot of 60-year-olds that are eager to do that kind of employment. So that kind of stimulus plan and particular policy wouldn't fly very well in that country. You have to do something else. Is that an adequate response to what you're saying or not?
I don't know. It just seems to me that there's a lot more to it than just social networks in terms of determining how people deal with issues as complex as the one you've chosen to study.
Oh, yeah, well, I looked at the social networks here, but we're not looking only at social networks, but we're looking at the ideologies and preferences of different groups. And so how are those ideologies and preferences clustered and empowered through coalitions? You know, and how strong are the different preferences? For instance, under Bush, you know, we had a dominant view of sort of led by Rush Limbaugh that global climate change is a myth.
And it was Senator Inhofe, right? It was Senator Inhofe.
Right, Senator Inhofe, the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on mankind. And now you have something totally different. So you look at the ideologies or various value profiles of different organizations, and those include a lot of these social issues or you know, national vulnerability issues or perceptions of vulnerabilities and other factors that drive preferences. So we're not only looking at configurations of social networks, but how social networks convey beliefs, different types of beliefs, and knit different organizations into common beliefs and common frameworks of reference to the problem, and help to politically empower those different groups in different situations. You still seem skeptical.
Well, an example, the debate in the UK has changed significantly in the last 5 years, away from focusing on energy production and toward energy usage, in part because industry rebelled against the costs of doing as well as they were doing on your scale. I suppose at some level of generality you can accommodate explaining that through talking about social network, but that was a radical change in the definition of the problem and how to go at it.
Yeah,
It
so
hasn't fully reflected itself in UK official policy yet, but you can see that change. I don't explain it just in terms of shifts in social networks.
Oh, I don't either. And the project wouldn't plan to. This is one element in how, you know, the beliefs, the shifts in belief, you know, are resulting from new intellectual currents, you know, but and at a slice in time data collection point, you can't really understand the shifts too well either, but you can understand differences, say, in beliefs about what to do about climate change. Should we use conservation, or should we develop new sources of energy as a priority, or what, you know? And the density or strength of those beliefs would differ across nations very much. And you can look that way and say, well, they're influencing national policies at this moment in time.
Healthy?
I was just wondering, are you trying to explain policies? Or are you trying to explain outcomes? So in other words, there was that chart up there about the EU, because the EU, all the countries have bought into Kyoto, but there's really vastly different outcomes. You know, the Mediterranean countries like Spain and Portugal actually have increased, I think, their actual emissions more than the US in percentage terms. So I think those are, in other words, what is actually dependent variable? Is it acceptance of Kyoto or something else, or?
Well, the ultimate dependent variable will be the greenhouse gas emission trends. But there's a lot of factors, like with Kyoto Protocol, they allowed Spain and Portugal to increase. They gave them allowances. So even though they signed, they didn't have to make reductions.
Is it true that overall EU has not met its goals under Kyoto? That's what I understand.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
So even though they've sort of divvied it up, so, I mean, I think that there's a powerful argument, you know, almost everybody, the Kyoto's in a sense has been a failure. You know, that kind of regime didn't, no matter with all the well-intentioned, I mean, you can say that the US, that we contribute to, because all the things that we buy incorporate CO2 emissions that come from China. So that even though it doesn't look like we've increased our emissions relatively that much, in other words, this measurement of what the outcome actually, I think it's very tricky.
But yeah, I think there's a great opportunity here to complement the literature on policy and on the probability of policy implementation and political science, and in fact, even international business and economics in the last 7-8 years. I think one of the interesting contributions has come on how we measure the stability of policy, public policy, and veto points in the formal political processes for this. So work by Vid Hainish, work at the World Bank. Here, this is about the formal ways in which we go from being a bill or regulation that's put into play. So that might be a map that would explain why Germany moves faster than the US or Japan. What it strikes me you're offering, Jeff, that I think is so helpful and complementary is, here is a map of the informal social networks with with information on the preferences and maybe the ideologies, the social veto points that go with this. And so if we were to see, for instance, countries that have a formal setup that would suggest they could act, and yet they don't, here is a story you can give them as to why they don't, because there's this other informal set of relationships, and I can show you where those veto points are and why policy doesn't change because of that. I think you have a great opportunity to contribute to those kinds of debates
That's an interesting
that are largely
point.
dominated by the political scientists right now.
Yeah.
Society is more powerful with regard to the outcomes than the formal policy.
Right.
Yeah, societies are more
Powerful
Right,
than
right,
formal
right.
policy, because.
informal procedures.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because even in the United States, I think would be, because everything's constant in the United States, so you can take different areas of the United States, not everything's constant.
And your contribution is to show that in a systematic and quantifiable, rather than kind of, it's just tough. If there are people in the informal environment who are against it, they can stop it. Here's a way, much like this literature on veto points and to show this systematically, comparatively across countries, even if only in one
Well, you
time.
can see, Jeff, that you've inspired a lot of speculation and ideas about this subject. And we have a practice of always ending right on time, too. So we want to thank you, and please come back again.
Here you go.
Commenting, very valuable comments.